The metallic echo of the last projectile still reverberated in the air when silence descended over the battlefield like an invisible shroud. It was that type of silence that doesn't signify peace, but rather the terrible pause before death returns to claim more victims. The black smoke from burning diesel mixed with the acrid smell of gunpowder and hot iron, creating a dense fog that transformed the winter landscape into a vision of frozen hell. The snow, which had begun falling during the early morning hours, melted upon contact with the superheated metals of destroyed armored vehicles, forming reddish pools that told the story of what had occurred there. In the midst of this desolation, a silhouette rose like a monument to human resistance. Tank T-34 number 864, with its faded olive-green paint and steel marked by scars that seemed etched by gigantic claws, remained motionless, but not defeated. Its crew, 5 men who had spent the last 72 hours living within the confines of that metal cylinder, knew they had witnessed something that transcends the limits of what is humanly possible. The commander, Major Alexei Petrov, a 34-year-old man whose face had aged a decade in the last 3 days, rested his forehead against the periscope sight, observing the devastated landscape that extended before them. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold that penetrated through the armor plates, but from the adrenaline that still coursed through his veins like liquid fire. The impacts. 847 direct hits. Each one should have been sufficient to convert their tank into a tomb of twisted steel. Each explosion had been a moment when death had extended its frozen hand toward them, only to be rejected by an inexplicable combination of Soviet engineering, blind luck, and an iron will that refused to break. The gunner, Sergeant Dmitry Volkov, a young man of barely 22 years who had learned to shoot hunting wolves in the Siberian forests, counted each destroyed enemy tank like someone counting the prayers of a rosary. 39 German armored vehicles now lay converted to smoking scrap, some so close to their position that he could see the petrified faces of terror of their crews through the open hatches. The main 76mm cannon had suffered structural damage after impact number 512, when a German armor-piercing projectile had struck directly at the tube's mouth, deforming it in such a way that firing had become a mortal gamble with each cartridge. However, Volkov had developed a unique technique, calculating the deviation caused by the deformation and compensating for it with manual adjustments that defied all known artillery manuals. He had transformed a useless weapon into an instrument of lethal precision, like a virtuoso who finds perfect melodies in a violin with broken strings. The historical context surrounding this epic confrontation dated back to the most ambitious plans of the Third Reich. It was the winter of 1943, and Operation Citadel had failed spectacularly at Kursk during the previous summer, marking the beginning of the irreversible decline of the German war machine on the Eastern Front. However, the German High Command, in an act of desperation that bordered on madness, had ordered a massive counter-offensive in the Leningrad sector, where Soviet forces appeared to be dispersed and vulnerable after months of continuous fighting. The 2nd Panzer Division, Das Reich, an elite unit that had participated in the initial victories of the Blitzkrieg and still retained the prestige of its triumphs in France and the first months of Barbarossa, had been assigned to lead this operation. Commanded by Oberführer Heinrich Müller, a 38-year-old veteran who had lost an eye at Stalingrad and whose Nazi fanaticism had intensified with each defeat. The division counted 120 tanks, including the feared Tiger I and several of the new Panthers, in addition to a complete contingent of self-propelled artillery and mechanized infantry. The morale of German troops, although tainted by recent defeats, remained artificially high thanks to propaganda that promised miracle weapons and definitive victories. On the Soviet side, the situation was complex and precarious. The 3rd Soviet Tank Army had suffered devastating losses during the autumn fighting, and its forces had been reduced to less than half of their theoretical strength. Major General Vasily Chuikov, the same hero who had defended Stalingrad house by house, had been assigned to reorganize the sector's defenses, but he had limited resources and insufficient time. The 45th Tank Brigade, to which T-34 number 864 belonged, had been hastily formed with reserves from the Moscow military region, and many of its tanks were older models that had been repaired multiple times with spare parts of dubious quality. Major Alexei Petrov had received his tank barely 3 weeks before the battle. His military record was impeccable. Son of a blacksmith from Tula, he had grown up among the noise of hammers and the heat of forges, developing an intuitive understanding of metal behavior under extreme pressure. He had enlisted in the Red Army in 1939, initially participating in the Winter War against Finland, where he had learned the brutal lessons of combat in Arctic conditions. His experience in Finland had been formative. He had seen how cold could kill as efficiently as any bullet, how machines failed when most needed, and how survival depended as much on adaptability as on courage. During the first months of the German invasion, Petrov had commanded an obsolete T-26 in the desperate battles of the retreat toward Moscow. He had seen how entire columns of Soviet tanks were destroyed by German tactical superiority, how lack of communications converted each combat into a series of individual duels where coordination was impossible. However, these bitter experiences had forged in him a unique combat philosophy. Each tank must be capable of operating as an independent unit. Its crew members must know each other so intimately that they could anticipate their companions' reactions, and each man must be prepared to assume multiple roles if the situation required it. His gunner, Sergeant Dmitry Volkov, came from a completely different background. Son of a professional hunter from Siberia, he had grown up in an environment where precision with a rifle was not a skill, but a matter of survival. His first marksmanship lessons had been with wolves that threatened the family livestock, shots that had to be lethal on the first attempt because a wounded animal becomes a more dangerous beast. This mentality of one shot, one death had been fundamental in his training as a tank gunner. Volkov had developed the ability to calculate distances, wind, and target movement with a precision his instructors considered supernatural. The driver, Corporal Pavel Rusanov, was a natural mechanic who had worked in the tractor factories of Stalingrad before the war. His understanding of engines was so deep that he could diagnose problems by sound, identify imminent failures by subtle changes in vibrations, and keep a tank running with parts that technically shouldn't function together. During the bombardments of Stalingrad, he had remained in the factory, repairing tanks under direct fire and developing improvised modifications that increased the survivability of armored vehicles in urban combat. The radio operator, Private Igor Petrov, no relation to the commander, had been an engineering student in Leningrad before the war. His ability to maintain communications functioning in the most adverse conditions was legendary among tank units in the region. He had developed techniques to repair damaged radios using components from destroyed equipment, and his understanding of tactical communications allowed his tank to coordinate attacks with units that were separated by kilometers of distance. The loader, Private Mikhail Semenov, the youngest of the crew at barely 19 years old, had compensated for his inexperience with a fanatical dedication to perfecting his technique. He could load and prepare projectiles with a speed that significantly reduced the time between shots, and had memorized the ballistic characteristics of each type of ammunition to the point of being able to recommend optimal selection for each specific type of target. The preparation for what would become the most epic battle of their lives had begun 3 days before the first contact with the enemy. Soviet intelligence reports had detected massive German troop movements in the sector, and the General Staff had ordered a defense in depth that would utilize every available topographical advantage. The terrain chosen for the main defensive position was a natural elevation that dominated a plain of approximately 5 kilometers wide, crossed by a partially frozen river that would channel any enemy advance toward predictable bottleneck points. T-34 number 864 had been positioned in a natural depression that had been reinforced with logs and frozen earth, creating an improvised casemate that protected the frontal armor while allowing a field of fire of almost 180 degrees. Petrov had insisted that his crew dig alternative positions connected by covered trenches so they could move the tank between different firing points without exposing themselves to enemy counter-battery fire. The technical modifications performed on the tank during these preparation days had been extensive and innovative. Rusanov had installed additional armor plates welded directly over the frontal glacis, using high-quality steel recovered from destroyed tanks. These modifications, although not authorized by the manual, significantly increased protection against German armor-piercing projectiles. Additionally, he had modified the internal ventilation system to improve gun gas extraction, reducing crew fatigue during prolonged combat. Volkov had personally calibrated each available ammunition cartridge, measuring variations in weight and verifying gunpowder quality. He had segregated the ammunition into categories according to expected precision, reserving the highest quality projectiles for high-value targets, like enemy heavy tanks. He had also developed a system of marks on the turret that allowed him to retain targets and calculate necessary deflections for moving targets. The communication system had been improved by Petrov, with additional antennas and improvised amplifiers that significantly extended transmission range. He had established alternative communication codes with other units in the sector and had memorized emergency frequencies for artillery and air support. The defensive strategy designed by the Soviet command depended on the ability of individual tank units to operate autonomously during prolonged periods. Supplies had been pre-positioned in caches dispersed throughout the defensive zone, including ammunition, fuel, rations, and basic spare parts. Each crew had received detailed maps that included alternative escape routes and regrouping points in case the main positions were overrun. The German attack began exactly at 05:30 on November 15, 1943, preceded by an artillery bombardment that lasted 45 minutes and transformed the winter landscape into a hell of pulverized earth and snow. The first waves of incendiary bombs had converted the sparse vegetation into smoking torches, while high-explosive projectiles had opened craters that permanently altered the battlefield topography. Petrov had kept his crew inside the tank during the entire bombardment, knowing that the armor's protection was superior to any improvised shelter. However, the nearby explosions had been so intense that the tank's interior had filled with metal dust and microscopic particles dislodged by the vibrations. The noise had been deafening, a continuous roar that had forced the crew to communicate through shoulder taps and predetermined gestures. When the bombardment ceased, the silence that followed was almost more terrifying than the previous noise. It was the silence that precedes the storm, the pause that allows attackers to reorganize and prepare for the final assault. Petrov had used these precious minutes to verify all tank systems, confirm that communications were functioning, and coordinate final positions with neighboring units. The first wave of German tanks appeared as dark points moving across the snowy plain, initially at a distance of more than 3 kilometers. Petrov had immediately identified the formation. 2 columns of Panzer IV leading the advance, followed by the more massive and threatening silhouettes of the Tiger Frö. It was a classic German formation designed to maximize firepower while minimizing exposure of the most valuable tanks. The first shot from T-34 number 864 was fired at 06:17, when the first enemy Panzer IV reached 200 meters distance. Volkov had selected a high-velocity, armor-piercing projectile, carefully calculating the necessary deflection to intercept the German tank that was moving laterally at approximately 25 kilometers per hour. The projectile had flown for 3-2 seconds before impacting directly on the Panzer IV's frontal glasses, penetrating the armor and detonating the stored ammunition. The resulting explosion had sent pieces of burning metal flying in all directions, and the German tank had stopped abruptly, enveloped in black, thick flames. The German response had been immediate and devastating. Enemy gunners had identified the Soviet shot position through the cannon flash and smoke cloud, and within seconds, a rain of German projectiles had begun falling around the T-34. The first direct hit had occurred barely 2 minutes after the first Soviet shot, when a 75mm projectile had struck directly on the tank's turret. The sound had been indescribable, a metallic roar followed by a vibration that had shaken the entire crew like rag dolls. However, the armor had resisted, although the impact had left a deep mark and had damaged one of the observation periscopes. Petrov had felt in that moment that they had just received a direct message from death, a warning that each additional second of life was a gift they should not waste. The following impacts had arrived with a frequency and precision that defied everything the crew had previously experienced. German gunners had established a coordinated fire pattern that kept the T-34 under constant bombardment, while other enemy tanks maneuvered to obtain more favorable shooting angles. Each impact had been a test of resistance for both metal and the men who inhabited it. Projectile number 23 had impacted directly on the driver's hatch, deforming it in such a way that Rusanov had been temporarily trapped in his position. The twisted metal had pressed against his right shoulder, causing him intense pain that he had tried to ignore while continuing to maneuver the tank between the prepared defensive positions. Only after the battle would it be discovered that he had 3 fractured ribs and a shoulder dislocation. Impact number 41 had been particularly devastating. An 88mm projectile fired by one of the Tiger I had struck directly at the base of the turret, exactly at the junction with the hull. The blow had been so violent that Semenov had been thrown against the interior wall of the tank, temporarily losing consciousness. When he had regained consciousness 30 seconds later, he had discovered he was bleeding from the nose and had a constant ringing in his ears. However, he had continued loading ammunition with a determination that bordered on obsession. During the first 3 hours of combat, the T-34 had destroyed 12 enemy tanks while receiving 143 direct hits. Each destruction had required multiple shots due to the progressive damage the main cannon was suffering. Volkov had developed a compensatory technique that implied calculating not only the standard deflection, but also the variations caused by tube deformation. It was deadly mathematics he performed instinctively, adjusting each shot according to the specific type of damage the cannon had accumulated. The most critical moment had arrived when impact number 212 had seriously damaged the cannon's elevation system. The hydraulic mechanism had been perforated by shrapnel fragments, and Volkov had had to resort to manual operation. This had meant that each elevation adjustment required considerable physical effort, and that target acquisition speed had been dramatically reduced. However, he had compensated for this limitation by developing a pre-positioning technique that allowed him to anticipate enemy movements and have the cannon oriented in the correct direction before targets were visible. Communication with command had been intermittent throughout the battle. Enemy impacts had repeatedly damaged external antennas, and Petrov had had to repair the radio system multiple times using spare parts and improvised knowledge. The only transmissions he had managed to send had been brief reports on the number of enemy tanks destroyed and requests for ammunition resupply that he knew were impossible to fulfill given the intensity of enemy fire. When the sun reached its highest point of the day, combat had entered a new phase. The Germans had modified their tactics, using artificial smoke to conceal their tanks' movements while concentrating artillery fire on the Soviet position. The T-34 had become the center of a steel hurricane, with enemy projectiles continuously impacting not only on the tank itself, but on the surrounding terrain, creating a constant rain of earth, rocks, and metal fragments. Impact number 360 had caused the first significant internal damage. A projectile had partially penetrated the side armor, creating a fissure that had allowed the entry of toxic gases and incandescent fragments. Semenov had suffered burns on his left arm, but had continued operating with an efficiency that had impressed even his veteran companions. He had wrapped the burns with rags soaked in motor oil and had continued loading ammunition as if nothing had happened. Conditions inside the tank had progressively deteriorated as combat continued. Interior temperature had increased due to heat generated by continuous main cannon firing and residual heat from enemy impacts on the exterior armor. The air had become almost unbreathable, charged with gunpowder smoke, burned oil vapors, and metallic dust. The crew had begun experiencing symptoms of mild carbon monoxide poisoning, including intense headaches and intermittent nausea. Ammunition shortage had become a critical problem toward midday. The T-34 had begun the battle with 42 projectiles of various types, a standard load that normally would have been sufficient for several minor combats. However, the intensity of the engagement had rapidly exhausted reserves. Petrov had ordered even more selective use of ammunition, reserving the last armor-piercing projectiles for the highest value targets and using high-explosive ammunition against targets of opportunity. The most desperate moment had arrived when the tank had completely run out of main ammunition. It was 14:30, and combat had been raging for more than 9 continuous hours. The Germans, apparently aware of the T-34's critical situation, had intensified their pressure, sending 3 Panzer IV tanks in a coordinated attack from 3 different directions. In this impossible situation, Volkov had made a decision that defied all military logic. He had begun using the crew's hand grenades as improvised ammunition for the main cannon. He had removed the grenades' fuses and had inserted them into blank cartridges, creating improvised projectiles that, although they lacked the penetration power of standard ammunition, could cause significant damage if they impacted vulnerable components like vision systems, antennas, or open hatches. The first experimental shot had been directed against a Panzer IV approaching from the left flank. The improvised projectile had impacted directly on the enemy commander's main periscope, effectively blinding the German tank and forcing it to stop while the crew attempted to repair their observation systems. During this pause, Volkov had fired a second improvised projectile that had impacted on the driver's hatch, causing damage that had forced the German tank to retreat. This desperate innovation had worked well enough to keep the T-34 in combat for 2 additional hours. However, the effectiveness of these improvised projectiles was limited, and each shot increased the risk of permanently damaging the already deteriorated cannon. Petrov had calculated that they had, at best, sufficient improvised ammunition for 10 additional shots before being forced to abandon the tank. The situation had changed dramatically at 16:45, when a Soviet reconnaissance patrol had managed to reach the T-34's position, carrying a small amount of replacement ammunition. It was only 8 armor-piercing projectiles and 4 high-explosive ones, but they represented a new opportunity for life. The patrol soldiers had risked their lives running through enemy fire to deliver the ammunition, and 2 of them had been wounded in the process. With renewed ammunition, Volkov had resumed combat with renewed ferocity. His first target had been a Tiger I that had been harassing the position from a distance of 800 meters. The armor-piercing projectile had flown in a perfect trajectory, impacting at the junction between the turret and hull of the German tank. The explosion had been spectacular, with red and orange flames that had reached more than 10 meters in height, and a column of black smoke that had risen toward the gray evening sky. The last moments of combat had been the most intense. German commanders, apparently frustrated by their inability to silence the solitary T-34, had ordered a final assault that had involved all remaining tanks of the formation. 18 German armored vehicles had advanced simultaneously from multiple directions, creating a crescendo of fire that had made the previous combats seem like minor skirmishes. In these final moments, each crew member had transcended his human limitations. Rusanov had maneuvered the tank with a precision that defied the laws of physics, using every terrain depression, every available obstacle to minimize exposure to enemy fire while maintaining favorable shooting angles. His hands, despite the constant pain from fractured ribs, had operated the controls with the delicacy of a surgeon and the strength of an Olympic athlete. Volkov had reached a state of almost supernatural concentration. Each shot had been calculated not only to destroy the immediate target, but to create secondary effects that complicated the maneuvers of other enemy tanks. He had used burning tanks as visual obstacles, had taken advantage of enemy ammunition explosions to create craters that channeled the movement of remaining armored vehicles, and had coordinated his shots with Soviet artillery impacts that had begun arriving from distant positions. The final impact, number 847, had arrived exactly at 1833, when the sun began descending toward the western horizon. An 88mm projectile had struck directly on the front part of the turret, exactly where projectile number 41 had impacted hours before. The metal, weakened by previous impacts and accumulated stresses, had finally begun to yield. A fissure had appeared in the frontal armor, an irregular line that had grown slowly like a wound opening. However, even this catastrophic damage had not been sufficient to stop the T-34. Petrov had ordered them to continue fighting until the last projectile was fired. Volkov, with blood running down his face due to a shrapnel fragment that had penetrated through the fissure, had carefully aligned his last shot. The target was a Panzer IV that had been providing support fire from an elevated position at 400 meters distance. The final shot had been perfect. The projectile had flown in a trajectory that seemed guided by a divine hand, impacting exactly in the center of the enemy turret. The explosion had been visible from kilometers away, a fireball that had momentarily illuminated the entire battlefield. With this destruction, the final count had reached 39 enemy tanks destroyed. The silence that had followed this last shot had been absolute. The Germans, after losing almost half of their armored force against a single Soviet tank, had ordered a general retreat. Enemy columns had begun moving westward, leaving behind a battlefield that resembled a cemetery of twisted metal and shattered dreams. The psychological consequences of combat had begun manifesting immediately after the ceasefire. Petrov had attempted to stand inside the tank and had discovered that his legs trembled uncontrollably. It wasn't fear. Fear had disappeared hours before, replaced by a fatalistic acceptance of their destiny. It was the physical shock of having survived something that, by all laws of probability and military logic, should have killed them dozens of times. Volkov had experienced a different form of post-combat shock. During the following hours, he had continued performing instinctive aiming movements every time he heard metallic noises, as if his body had been programmed to respond to threats that no longer existed. His hands had developed a fine but persistent tremor that had taken days to completely disappear. Rusanov had suffered what would later be identified as a severe form of operational fatigue. His reflexes, sharpened during combat to superhuman levels, had collapsed abruptly once adrenaline had stopped flowing through his system. He had needed help to exit the tank and had slept for 16 continuous hours once he had been evacuated to a safe position. Petrov, the radio operator, had developed partial but permanent hearing loss due to continuous explosions and gunfire noise in the tank's confined space. However, he had considered this a small price for having participated in what he recognized as a historical moment that transcends normal military experiences. Semenov, despite being the youngest, had shown the fastest recovery. His youth had been an advantage, allowing him to process combat trauma in a way that had avoided the most severe psychological sequelae. However, he had developed an obsession with efficiency that had continued long after the war's end, a compulsive perfectionism that he applied to all activities of his civilian life. The historical impact of this singular battle had begun manifesting immediately. Combat reports had reached the Soviet General Staff within 12 hours, and the news that a single tank had resisted 847 direct hits while destroying 39 enemy armored vehicles had initially been received with incredulity. Only after multiple witnesses had confirmed the facts, and after Soviet engineers had physically examined the T-34's remains, had the reality of what had occurred been accepted. The Germans, for their part, had immediately classified all reports related to this battle. The idea that a single Soviet tank could have resisted the combined efforts of a complete panzer division was unacceptable to Nazi propaganda, which depended on the image of German technical and tactical superiority. Official German reports had attributed the losses to exceptionally difficult combat conditions and unforeseen fanatical resistance, avoiding any specific mention of T-34 No. 864's role. However, among professional military circles on both sides, the battle had rapidly acquired legendary status. Soviet engineers had immediately begun intensive studies of the damaged tank, analyzing how the armor had resisted impacts that theoretically should have been lethal. The conclusions of these studies had influenced the design of subsequent Soviet tanks, including improvements in armor metallurgy and modifications in turret geometry. German tacticians had conducted their own analyses, focusing on understanding how a single unit had managed to deny the numerical superiority of an entire formation. Their conclusions had led to changes in German armored combat doctrines, including renewed emphasis on infantry and artillery coordination to suppress defensive positions before tank attacks. The most significant aspect of the historical impact had been the demonstration that individual resistance could alter the course of massive military operations. The German retreat after this battle had allowed Soviet forces to consolidate defensive positions that had remained stable during the rest of the winter, effectively altering the strategic balance throughout the northern sector of the Eastern Front. The following months had brought official and unofficial recognitions for the crew of T-34 number 864. Petrov had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and had received the Order of the Red Star, one of the most prestigious military decorations of the Soviet Union. Volkov had been decorated with the Order of Glory, specifically for his innovation in using improvised ammunition when standard reserves had been exhausted. However, official recognitions had been eclipsed by the informal reputation the crew had developed among Soviet armored forces. Their tank had been repaired and had returned to combat, carrying a new nickname painted in Cyrillic on the frontal armor: Besmurtny, the Immortal. This name had captured not only the vehicle's extraordinary physical resistance, but also the indomitable spirit of its crew members. The lessons learned from this battle had transcended immediate military applications. The demonstration that meticulous preparation, innovation under pressure, and perfect coordination among individuals could overcome apparently insurmountable material advantages had influenced Soviet strategic thinking during the rest of the war. The principles developed by the T-34 crew, operational autonomy, technical adaptability, and psychological resistance, had been incorporated into training programs for subsequent armored units. The story had continued long after the end of hostilities. In post-war Soviet Union, the tale of the Immortal tank had been included in military academy curricula as a case study in leadership under extreme pressure. The tactics developed by Volkov to compensate for cannon damage had been analyzed and refined, contributing to the development of new aiming techniques that had remained classified for decades. In the post-war period, crew members had followed diverse paths, but all marked by their shared experience. Petrov had remained in the army, eventually reaching the rank of Major General before retiring in 1965. His memoirs, published in 1970, had provided one of the most detailed accounts of armored combat under extreme conditions ever documented. In these writings, he had repeatedly emphasized that his crew's success had not been the result of individual heroism, but of systematic preparation and absolute mutual trust. Volkov had returned to Siberia after the war, but had maintained his connection with the military world as a shooting instructor at an officers' school. His techniques for compensating weapon system damage had been studied and officially adopted by the Soviet Army. During the 1950s and 1960s, he had trained hundreds of gunners who had carried his methods to subsequent conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and other regions where Soviet forces had been indirectly involved. Rusanov had used his mechanical skills to contribute to the development of the post-war Soviet automotive industry. His improvised modifications of tank systems during the battle had inspired innovations in civilian vehicle design, particularly in transmission and suspension systems that could operate in adverse conditions. He had worked in the Gorky automobile factories until his retirement, always maintaining a meticulous approach to engineering that reflected the lessons learned during those desperate days on the battlefield. Petrov, the radio operator, had leveraged his communications experience to build a career in the civilian telecommunications industry. His innovations in equipment repair under adverse conditions had contributed to the development of more robust communication systems for use in remote regions of the Soviet Union. He had maintained regular correspondence with his former crew members for decades, organizing annual reunions that had continued until the 1980s. Semenov had followed a completely different trajectory, using the discipline and attention to detail developed during the war to build an academic career. He had become a professor of military history, specializing in the analysis of individual combats that had had disproportionate strategic impacts. His lectures on the Battle of T-34 number 864 had been legendary in Soviet universities, not only for the first-hand knowledge he brought, but for his ability to extract universal principles of leadership and resistance from specific experience. T-34 number 864 itself had had a remarkable fate after the battle. After extensive repairs that had taken 3 months, it had returned to combat with a new crew, carrying its reputation as a talisman of invincibility. During the rest of the war, it had participated in 12 additional battles, always emerging damaged but never destroyed. This record had reinforced the belief, both among Soviet troops and German enemies, that certain vehicles and units possessed special luck or protection that transcended normal military considerations. After the end of the war in Europe, the tank had been selected to participate in the Victory Parade in Moscow's Red Square on June 24, 1945. Its participation in this historic event had cemented its place in Soviet military mythology. Photographs from the parade, showing the T-34 with its battle scars visible but its colors bright under the Moscow sun, had been reproduced in countless publications and had come to symbolize the resistance of the Soviet people during the war. In subsequent decades, the tank had been preserved as a monument in the Central Museum of the Armed Forces in Moscow. Visitors had been able to directly observe the marks of the 847 impacts, many of which had remained visible despite repairs. Museum guides had related the battle's story for decades, each narration adding new details and perspectives that had kept the memory of the event alive. The international legacy of the battle had been equally significant. Technical analyses conducted by Western military intelligence after the war had revealed details about Soviet defensive capabilities that had influenced NATO doctrine development during the Cold War. The demonstration that apparently inferior forces could resist massive attacks through superior preparation and determination had informed European defense strategies for decades. In the broader context of World War II, the Battle of T-34, number 864, had represented a microcosm of the principles that had led to final Soviet victory. The capacity to resist extreme pressure, adapt tactics to changing circumstances, and maintain operational effectiveness despite limited resources had characterized not only this individual battle, but the general Soviet response to German invasion. Military historians had continued studying and debating the technical and tactical aspects of the battle decades after its conclusion. Some had argued that success had been primarily the result of technical factors, superior quality of Soviet armor, deficiencies in German ammunition, or meteorological conditions that had favored the defenders. Others had emphasized human factors, exceptional crew training, their perfect coordination, and their refusal to accept defeat even when circumstances seemed desperate. However, consensus among the most serious analysts had been that the true significance of the battle transcended specific technical or tactical considerations. It had demonstrated universal principles about human potential under extreme pressure, the importance of meticulous preparation, and the power of collective determination to overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles. In the final words of Petrov's memoirs, published shortly before his death in 1978, he had written, "We were not heroes that day. We were 5 ordinary men who had been extraordinarily well prepared, who had learned to trust each other completely, and who had decided we preferred to die fighting than live with the shame of surrender. The tank was not immortal. We simply refused to accept our mortality until the job was finished." This final reflection had captured the essence of why the Battle of T-34 number 864 had transcended its specific military context to become a story of universal human resistance. It had not been about superior technology or brilliant tactics, but about the capacity of ordinary individuals to achieve extraordinary accomplishments when united by common purpose and meticulous preparation. The echo of those 847 impacts had continued reverberating long after the last projectiles had found their mark, long after the smoke had dissipated and snow had covered the battlefield's scars. It had reverberated in lessons learned by military forces around the world, in technical innovations inspired by desperate necessity, in careers built on the foundations of experience under fire, and in expanded understanding of what is possible when preparation meets determination at history's crucial